Hey everybody, I meant to get this out to you yesterday, but so sorry. Good things come to those who wait. I wanted to finish chapter 4 kind of quickly for you so that you're ready for the quiz on Monday and to be prepared for the chapter test on Wednesday. So Monday, a little quiz over chapter 4. Wednesday, we're having a test over chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. So please make sure you review notes. Let me go back a little bit, actually. So just a quick review. Make sure you know what the percentage is of nonverbal communication. So 60% of your communication comes from nonverbal qualities, or something that accompanies your verbal message. So that's how you use space, your treatment of time, self-presentation, any use of body is a form of what we like to call kinesics, which is a form of nonverbal communication. Quick review, I know we covered these in class, but I'm just making sure we're clear on the differences of these. So if you substitute a verbal message, like if I say hello or peace, then that's considered an emblem. So I have a nonverbal act which is completely substituting a verbal message. It need no more communication to go with it for it to be interpreted correctly. I'm not saying it's not open to misinterpretation, but for the most part, as long as you're part of the same speech community, those are pretty clear. If you emphasize a message, this is called, when I'm using my hands to illustrate space or time, we're emphasizing nonverbal communication. Contradict, so if I'm using a nervous smile and I'm delivering bad news, you guys actually had a great example in class. So you said, if I were to pick up my phone and look at it while I'm talking to you, is this example of contradiction. I think that one alone is more regulate, which is the last one. So I'm regulating the conversation. Normally I would nod at you to encourage you to continue talking, but I can also regulate conversation in a negative capacity. So I can encourage you to stop communicating with me. So I think if I were to just look at my phone while you were talking, then that's considered a regulation of conversation, not a contradiction. However, if I were to tell you, yes, I'm totally listening to you while I'm texting, I think that might contradict the message a little. I hope that makes sense. So I want to make sure we get all of those down because it's going to be confusing, I think, in the test when you see them all together. So anything that uses your body is a form of nonverbal communication. It's called kinesics. So gestures or emblems that we talked about, the substitutes for words, illustrators augment, and adapters respond to a physical need. So for example, if I'm scratching my nose, or if I'm flipping hair out of off my shoulder, all of this is considered an adapter, but it could have a nonverbal interpretation. You may not be encoding a message, but your receiver is certainly decoding it. So for example, if you scratch a lot or move a lot during a conversation, that could be interpreted as nervousness. Whereas, as we talked about in class, some people think that if you move your hair around or play with your hair, it's considered flirtatious. I don't know if I think that's true or not. It's certainly open for debate. I think it could be just a form of maybe a nervous habit. We talked about eye contact in class, about how important it is for the United States, for the most part, for American countries, but in some Arabic countries. In other words, it's not considered respectful. So that's why it's so important to be part of the same speech community. Okay? Another form of kinesics is your posture. So when you're doing your nonverbal scavenger hunt, one of the things very specifically talk about your body orientation. So, how motivated your movement is or unmotivated, if your shoulders are slumped, if you're sitting up straight. All of these are giving some sort of nonverbal communication. They're just as powerful as facial expressions or eye contact, as we talked about. Interestingly enough, I'm going a little bit out of order, and I think you probably have noticed this, that when you talk to somebody, you're actually making less eye contact with the person who's talking to you. Because, and I don't know, I think that would be an interesting idea for a paper. Why is it that when we're talking to somebody, we feel the need to break eye contact more so than when we listen? Is it because we are also distracted by encoding the message? No, interesting thought. I would like to hear your thoughts on that. So let's make sure we know what emblems are. It has a direct verbal translation. So handshakes, shaking fists, something like that. The thumbs up gesture in some areas is not okay. It's not that at all. Or, for example, once I was in Turkey, and we were all having dinner with one of our host families, and it was a delicious dinner. And one of my colleagues, when the husband asked him, how was the dinner, he gave him the okay symbol, much like what you're seeing here. But that's not what it was interpreted as. So in Turkey, for example, that was considered offensive. We'll talk later about the meaning of that, but it was just considered offensive. So, unfortunately, my friend had encoded a message that was decoded very differently than what he anticipated. So illustrators or emphasizers, that emphasizes the point. So the one that got away was this big. Affect displays are facial movements that used to convey meaning. So emotions, your eyes wide, your eyebrows raised for surprise. You've heard them saying somebody has a poker face. That means they've schooled their face to not reveal what they're thinking. I'm going to be honest, I don't really have that. My face usually says what I'm thinking pretty clearly. I don't know if that's good or bad. That would be interesting to think about facial expressions and what you think they mean and how they're interpreted. Regulators, again, we did a preview, now I'm doing just a kind of a review, is when I do something to direct conversation, either to encourage the conversation or to discourage it from continuing. So if I ask you a question, you avoid eye contact, whether or not you know it, you're regulating that conversation. You're letting me know you don't want to engage in it. And there's a form of ethical nonverbal communication. So when you're regulating, it's very important that you keep that in mind for the person to whom you're communicating. Make sure that you're being respectful about that. And I'm not going to get into the gender discussion, because you guys get all wild about that. So adapters is what I was talking about a moment ago. This is something that has a physical need. So you're just responding to a physical need, but it does have a form of nonverbal communication. So for example, if I'm always messing with my wedding ring, what does that mean? It could just be a nervous habit, but could you interpret that as something different? I don't know. That's something for you to think about. I would love, that's one thing I don't like about sending you the video links, because I can't get your thoughts. And to me, that is the most interesting part of this, is that discussion and what you tell me. This is an excellent test question, guaranteed quiz question. The use of time is also a form of nonverbal communication. So how you view time and the way others interpret your use of time is a form of chronemics. So that is how I view time in terms of nonverbal communication. Okay. So on the U.S., for example, we focus on exact time. We're very punctual. We believe things should go one thing at a time. But we also believe that there should be some niceties, some social niceties that preface taking care of business, if that makes sense. So we believe there should be a little small talk. So there's unwritten rules of how we view time, how we treat time. Okay, so the United States example, we have a monochronic time orientation, which means we emphasize doing things one at a time. We have schedules that we adhere to, and we schedule things in our interpersonal relationships. So for example, if I tell you I'm going to meet you at 3, I'll meet you at 3. And a lot of Americans they would view you not being there at 3 as a form of rudeness or disrespect. So we have a more rigid view of time orientation, whereas a lot of other countries are polychronic, which means they can do multiple things at once. It's a little bit more flexible in terms of schedules, and that may not convey a sense of respect or disrespect, if that makes sense. So, for example, I have this beautiful Peruvian student who's one of my dearest friends now, but we always had an issue when he and I were scheduling things, because I would say, be in the office at 2, and he would kind of take that as, that could be around 1 and 3. And it took me a while to realize that that wasn't disrespectful, it wasn't rude, it was just a more relaxed view of time. So how you view time and how you treat time does say something about you. How early you are for a meeting, how late you are for a meeting. And again, that kind of depends, it's relative on the speech community. So for example, if somebody makes you late, after a while you would view that as a form of disrespect, or think that you weren't being viewed as highly as you'd like to be. So for example, if you were late to class every time, even though you might have a very valid reason for it, that would have an ethical decoding on my part. And the same thing would go with you. So if I was consistently late for class, you would, over time, believe that I didn't view the class as important as I do. Does that make sense? So you have to think about your ethical chronemics. Are you rushing in late to class? Are you packing up in that last 5 minutes to leave? And I know every student does this because you only have 10 minutes in between classes in some cases. But doing that it sends a nonverbal message. You're saying that I have ceased listening to this conversation. It is no longer valuable to me, and I've already moved on to my next task, which could have some detrimental impact on you and your communication with your professor. Also, you'll notice that I always get to class a little bit early, and then I'm just antsy for 11 o'clock or 2 o'clock to hit. I want to start class. And normally that's right when the quiz starts. So if you come in late, not only are you ethically sending a message you might not want to be encoding, but you're missing possibly a quiz score or two. Okay, so I'm not using it as a soapbox. I'm just saying I think it's a really interesting component, definitely on the test. Olfactics is a form of nonverbal communication. So your sensory input, like smells. For example, I used to have a colleague in CMARCh4 who I did not realize this until much later. He was terribly allergic to perfume, and I'm one of those people that believes if 1 squirt of Marc Jacobs Daisy smells good, then 5 would smell much better. So I was unintentionally communicating to him distress and perhaps lack of respect because I didn't understand his allergies, if that makes sense to you. So you have to think about what smells you're conveying. So for example, the smell of patchouli is a very specific perfume or aroma, if you will, and that communicates to me, I don't know, a sense of relaxation. Also, this is relative, so keep in mind that this is going to be relative to your own experiences. Does that make sense? So the smell of smoke, for example, if you pass someone and you think, oh, okay, that's a smoker, does that have a different message for you than it would for me? But obviously, olfactics is important because now there's an entire line and a booming business on aromatherapy and essential oils and scented waxes and things. So it's important to us to have smells that accompany or give us good nonverbal messages. Even though we don't think about it a lot, it's more than just having your home smell good. You want to smell relaxed. So for example, the Glade commercial, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but it shows, okay, this is what home smells like. And that's what we're trying to do, is create a sense of familiarity, right? So the sense of olfactics, for example, you'll notice a lot of realtors talk about baking bread or cookies before they show the home, because it automatically conveys a sense of hearth and home to potential buyers. So it's valuable. We use olfactics for a lot of reasons, and we communicate either intentionally or unintentionally. Haptics is the interpretation of touch. Now, obviously, there is a discussion of appropriate and inappropriate touch, but I think we're focusing more on intentional and unintentional communication by that. And I think that reaction to touch is affected very much by your preference, your family background, and your culture. So, for example, my family they're not huggers. They've never been a bunch of huggers. So it took me a long time to appreciate all my dear friends who hug in greeting and hug me goodbye. Because for me, it was interesting. It was an alien concept that you would hug all the time. But then I learned to adapt my form of communication to fit the person to whom I'm communicating. And obviously, reaction to touch differs within context. So, for example, two men holding hands in Arabic cultures simply indicates friendship, whereas in the United States, we might think of that as a romantic connotation, where it's completely platonic in other areas. Or sports contact. So without getting too much into that, you sports guys and ladies, excuse me, you do the little pats. And in any other context, that would be interpreted as inappropriate. But for whatever reason, in a sports context, it develops a sense of camaraderie, and you're non-verbally communicating fellowship and support in that moment. Handshaking in cultures can also indicate a different form of nonverbal communication. So I'm sure when you were growing up, your parents taught you to have a firm handshake, to make direct eye contact, because it communicates a sense of confidence and respect. In other cultures, though, sometimes that handshake could encode something completely different than what you intend. And I hate to say it, but I still do this. I still make judgment calls based on handshakes. So obviously haptics is important. I think honestly too, haptics has to do with space, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but how far you are away from the person with whom you're communicating indicates a nonverbal form of communication as well. So paralanguage is the use of voice without the words. So it's anything involving vocalics, so the interpretation of the message based on paralinguistic features. So paralanguage is the voiced but not verbal part of a spoken message. So my pitch, my volume, my rate, the timbre of my voice, intonation, vocalized pauses. So if I come to you and I'm telling you a story and I'm speaking very quickly and kind of loudly, you would interpret from that, oh, she's excited or frightened. But if I were to be very slow, you might interpret from that, I don't know, what would you interpret with slowness? I mentioned this in class, but what I find fascinating about Fred Rogers from that documentary that I watched, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Highly recommend it. He was a very slow, intentional speaker who purposely paced his language deliberately, used silence to convey authenticity and transparency, and it worked well for him. Now, for people who just met him, Yo-Yo Ma, for example, said that first conversation with him was a little uncomfortable because he wasn't used to such engaged, directed, intentional, nonverbal paralanguage with the message, if that makes sense. Those pauses in your tone indicate so much of the meaning. So if I were to say, I'm glad to see you could make it tonight, I think you would take that as honest. But if you were to walk into class 2 minutes late and I say, glad to see you could make it, obviously there's a sense of sarcasm with that. Kind of goes back to what your mother told you when you were growing up, and she would say, don't use that tone with me, and you would say, what tone? But you knew what she was talking about because you had used the tone. Because you wanted to convey a sense of displeasure without actually encoding that into a verbal message. So you have to think about the tone. I know this is a lot to think about. I think that's why I find this chapter so fascinating. Is not only do we have to think very carefully about our words, but how we convey those with our uses of our facial expressions and hands and space and paralanguage. It's so involved. So the use of space, proxemics, this is something that you definitely want to know for the test. Basically, it's how much space you have between you and the people or person to whom you're communicating. So, for example, if I go to a restaurant, just last night my husband and I went out to eat. We look across and there's a young couple and they're sitting right next to each other on the same side of the booth. And from that, I'm interpreting, oh, that's probably a first date or early in the relationship. But, that could be completely judgmental and wrong. Maybe that doesn't mean that at all, right? This is the reason why most of the presidential speeches are given in the Oval Office, because there's a sense of gravitas and maturity and importance placed on the space that the speaker's using. And that's simply because how we use our physical environment, that physical space, does convey something. So you need to know these terms. The physical space is the part of the physical environment over which you exert control. So how you're taking up space and what you're doing with it. When you're giving a speech, are you using deliberative, motivated movement? Are you using unmotivated movement? How you're using that space communicates something. You also need to know the different variations of personal space. Now, this will be multiple choice on the test, but you need to know that an intimate personal space is someone with whom you feel close or have a close relationship or having a private conversation is usually intimate, up to 18 inches. Personal distance, normally, in just a casual conversation, is 18 inches to 4 feet. Social distance is 4 to 12 feet. Like, for example, if I were in an interview or you came into my office to talk about advising or something, and you sat across my desk, that would be a social distance. However, if I asked you to pull up closely, let's say I wanted to look at degree works with you, and I said, could you pull up your chair next to mine? Now we've gotten into personal space a little bit. Public space is what you would normally do for your speeches. You'll have about 12 feet between you and the audience. Now, our classroom is much smaller, so that wouldn't apply, but let's say you were in the Bailey Business Auditorium or in maybe AV room, then you definitely have that public space. So how much space you're using and what you're doing with that space conveys a nonverbal message, as do the artifacts that we use. So artifacts are objects and possessions that you use to decorate the physical space we control. So for example, if your dorm room is an artifact, how you decorate your dorm room. Do you have little tchotchkes in your car? Do you have something hanging from the rear view mirror? That's an artifact. Things that you put on your body is considered an artifact, but that's more personal than physical. So think about that in terms of territoriality. The very first day of class, you came and you claimed a space in the classroom. You put your backpack next to it. You did something to say, this space is mine. It's how we save seats. Like if I were to go to a theater or something, I might put a program or my jacket down on the seat. Because I'm claiming it, I'm using this artifact to claim the space as my own. Space is obviously very important. For example, we like to create the illusion of more space in close quarters, like elevators, for example. This is why you'll see a lot of mirrors, because we're trying to create more space. Technology, I think, helps with this. You'll notice a lot of people use televisions or different screens to convey more of a sense of space. And again, with artifacts, you're looking at territoriality. Your imaginary ownership. So do you have a parking space? Do you have a chair that you use? How many of you stayed in the exact same chair that you claimed that first day of class? Because we seem to own something. There's a sense of ownership, and that conveys something. It has a message. Again, I'm just reviewing the artifacts. So you do need to know the difference between personal and physical artifacts. So a personal artifact is my clothing, my shoes, my hairstyle, my jewelry, my eyeglasses. All of that conveys a nonverbal message. So for example, I like to wear really tall shoes. I like to wear tall heels. I don't know what that conveys nonverbally. In my head, I think it's conveying a sense of, oh, I'm kind of quirky and have a quirky sense of style, and I would like to express this. I don't know, I'm thinking. That's about all I can think of that I wanted to convey, but it could convey something different. I think if you didn't know me, you might look at it and go, boy, that's questionable. Could you even go so far as to say it's disrespectful in certain locales? And I think there's an argument that could be made for that. I will be honest, when we have major faculty meetings, I usually try to tone down my shoes just a little bit because I want to make sure that I'm conveying a sense of respect. I don't know if I'm successful with that or not, but I'm wondering if you guys can think about how you choose your shoes or your hair or your jewelry, because you are trying to communicate something non-verbally. What is it you're trying to convey, and do you think you're successful at it? Physical artifacts are the things that you put around you. So personal goes on you, physical goes around you. Your furniture, your artworks, what you choose to decorate your space. So what your dorm room looks like, your house or your car, all of that kind of becomes your brand. It represents who you are. So for example, my house has a lot of color. We have, the living room's in pumpkin, the kitchen's in an ice yellow, my room's a pale green, the bathroom's juniper berry, because I love color, I love eclectic style. So very much I would argue that my house non-verbally communicates a sense of who I am. It represents, also it's covered in cat hair, which non-verbally says that I'm a crazy cat lady. Many of you spent a lot of time working on your dorm room when you first got to campus because you were trying to express something non-verbally. And boy, I think I would love to have a gender discussion about that. My son's a teacher. I've talked to him about him a lot. And so he's been at this school for 3 years now, and he still hasn't really decorated his room because for him the focus is on the teaching, the pedagogy, more than the environment. I think that's interesting because that's a complete 180 from what I think, because I want to do it all, right? And he just wants to focus on that one thing. So thinking about your physical appearance, what you can and can't change, obviously. Your clothing and grooming is what you can change. And body art conveys something different for us, I think generationally. So my generation viewed tattoos and piercings and such as, oh, well, that's something very different. That conveys a sense of rebelliousness or nonconformity. But I think that has changed quite a bit over the years. And now it's simply viewed as art. It's a form of body art that expresses what you're thinking and feeling. So I love that it's evolved and changed. And I think it's continuing to evolve and change in positive ways, in more inclusive ways. So this book tells you very carefully to be careful about the nonverbal communication that you're sending, your nonverbal messages. So what kind of nonverbal behaviors are you displaying? Are you unintentionally displaying disrespect? I don't know. Do you think bad smells convey something? The book says yes, but part of me feels like that's a little exclusionary because sometimes those are things you can't help all the time. Does that make sense? But I do think you have to be conscious of it. I'll be honest, I wear less perfume than I used to just because I was thinking, is there another colleague that is allergic to perfume? And I'm making him or her uncomfortable, even though I really still like my Daisy perfume. You're also supposed to be very careful of your nonverbal communication, to convey what you want seen. So this is something I have to be careful with because I'm very hyper. I know, big surprise. So when I sit down, my body kind of goes into shock. I know that sounds weird. I can't think of another way to describe it. I have to be moving and talking and active, or I can become disengaged quicker than I mean to. So also I have terrible insomnia. So right about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, if I sit down and talk to somebody, I'm going to start yawning. And it has no bearing at all on the person or the message, but I know that I'm conveying something nonverbally that could be hurtful, so I try really hard to avoid that, but it does convey something. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong that we convey something nonverbally unintentionally. It is what it is. So make sure that your nonverbal cues do not distract from your message. So this is why I tell you when you're giving your speeches, try not to rock, try not to grab the podium, try not to play with rubber bands, or use those vocalized pauses. So all the times that you're saying, like, while you're giving a speech, that's distracting from your message. Make your nonverbal communication match your verbal communication. I don't think that's just obvious. For the most part, we do that, I think, pretty naturally. And you adapt your nonverbal behavior based on the context. Also, I think we have to be careful about interpreting nonverbal messages. You can't automatically assume that one behavior means the same to everyone. So, while tapping a foot could indicate annoyance or irritation to one person, it could simply indicate, what if they're like me and they have just a hard time sitting still? And so I try very hard to be graceful, gracious, and understanding when I'm interpreting those nonverbal cues. Some things we can't help, but some things we can. So, for example, when I'm in a meeting, me checking my phone all the time it's disrespectful, so I try not to do that. The same thing for class. So you just consider the nonverbal behaviors as they relate to the context of the message. So if you're texting a class or in a meeting or looking at your phone, I think it conveys something. Now, if I do have something happening, right, like I have maybe a little emergency going on, for example, my mom was sick, I would let people know, I'm so sorry, but I have to keep my phone on in case I get a specific text. So I want to make sure they understand I'm not being disrespectful. And you have to pay attention to all the multiple nonverbal cues that you're getting and not pay attention to just one over the other because they could be contradicting each other. And you've got to be open to decoding that in an understanding, fluid way. And so you should do perception checking. So my question to you would be, do you think a conversation can happen entirely without words? I kind of want to experiment with this a little bit. We'll see if we have time to do this on Monday. Can you have a conversation with somebody without using any words? I don't know if you can have a long one, but I think you could have short interactions with nonverbals and convey meaning. Can you think of any distracting mannerisms that you have or somebody else has that convey something nonverbally that maybe they don't? I really wish you could answer that because I'm so curious about that. If you think of one, please let me know in class because I think it's interesting. Obviously, I think emotion can be conveyed non-verbally. So don't forget, Monday, your nonverbal scavenger hunt is due. Now, you can turn that in a variety of ways. You could print it out, and write on it longhand if you'd like and just hand it to me in person. Or you could turn it in digitally on Canvas. I've given you both options. As long as I have it digitally by midnight. I need it by midnight Monday. Or in class, in person, unless you plan on dropping it by my office. But I need to have it before I leave Monday, okay? The scavenger hunt is supposed to be fun. Don't do a lot of in-depth. You find one of the... You're going to give me an example of each bit of nonverbal communication. And then you're just going to a brief description of it, and then tell me how you interpreted that nonverbal cues. And please don't forget, you've got 2 extra credit options that you can do. One is the nonverbal exercise, the experiment, where you break a nonverbal kind of tradition or rule, and then account what happened with that. And then don't forget you have the metaphors that you could rewrite. I'm sorry, the cliches that you could rewrite. Take 5 overused cliches, rewrite them with a new image but maintaining the meaning. You can do both of those if you'd like, and that would help immensely. I think this is probably our only extra credit option that I'm going to be able to give you this semester, so it's due by when you come back from fall break, so be thinking about that. Okay, you've got a 30-minute video. I'm going to let you go. Please make sure you look at this and that you review for the quiz on Monday. On Monday, we're going to finish our paired speeches, so you have not given your paired speech yet. You will be doing that Monday. And then we'll do a quick review over the test. Okay? I can tell you that your test is 100 points. There are, I'm going to say, 9 or 10 true or falses, and the rest is just multiple choice. With obviously many options. So it's 100 points. That's a lot of points. If I were you, I'd download that study guide and get cracking. Thank you so much for engaging in our flipped classroom model where we take the lecture and then we apply that. Talk about it later. I will see you Monday for a wonderful Chapter 4 quiz and a review. Have a great rest of your weekend.